Politics is never very far from horror. Whether it is the monstrous body politic of Hobbes' Leviathan, Bram Stoker's homogeneous British Empire, or the cathartic bloodbath of The Purge, politics seems to be a popular background for horror. In part, this is because we must have a centralized set of norms from which to deviate. The other must be marked as visible by the invisible standards of a given time and place, and the political state often fits the bill. Sometimes politics is too close to horror to allow for joy. This is especially true when the standard of normalcy is the cause of that horror. Recently, we can see this happening in the confluence of a nationalist spirit and the religious fervor of Christian evangelicalism. Referred to as Christian Nationalism, this has led to policies and practices that demand a rigid compliance to a set of beliefs. The horror of Christian nationalism is the demand on the bodies, minds, and lives of those that do not abide by those beliefs.
In this episode, we talked to scholar and podcaster Lucas Kwong about the relationship between horror and Christian nationalism, and find strangely common ground between Van Helsing's crusade in Dracula and the rise of QAnon, between the scares of found footage and the performative Christianity of YouTube, and between the Gothic landscape of Jordan Peele's Us and the post-capitalist malaise of 21st century America. Join us as we try to find the gap between the horror of our favorite stories and the horror of our everyday lives. While the gap seems to be dwindling by the day, we think there is some light that shines through and keeps our hope for joy alive. This is Horror Joy, a podcast celebrating the emotional and intellectual joys of horror. We're your hosts. I'm Brian Onishi, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Penn State Altoona.
And I'm Jeff Stoynoff, Assistant Professor of English at Penn State Altoona. So Brian, in today's episode, we're talking Christian nationalism and its Victorian roots of horror with Lucas Kwong, who is a professor at New York City College of Technology. We had a really interesting conversation with Lucas, thinking about the ways in which we see Christian nationalism with evangelicalism in the United States, how Catholicism is beginning to have some inroads there. We're not going to encroach too much on your brother's podcast here, but we are looking at sort of where we see these intersections and these confluences, and what sort of, I think, interesting Lucas brings from his podcast, which we talked with him a bit about, how these elements, these tropes, have roots going as far back to Victorian England. So, Brian, things you thought interesting in our conversation with Lucas today?
I always think that the history of horror images is interesting. So thinking about where Dracula maybe comes from or what it represents, that's fascinating. And Lucas has so much to say about that. His podcast, Monster in the Mirror, does a deep dive and worth the listen if you are interested. There's something that he says fairly early on about how horror reveals this sense in which parents or adults just don't tell children or young people about how weird the world is. And for some reason that has resonated with me very strongly, even in kind of more recent movies like Longlegs and Cuckoo. There's just something about that I hadn't really thought of, and now it seems like I can't stop thinking about. So that has just, I think, resonated with me, but also made me look at some of the more recent films that I'm watching through that lens, which is fascinating. You, Jeff, anything that stuck out to you in particular from our conversation with Lucas?
Just, looking at the sort of long history, talking to a fellow English professor and sort of how he reads things, it was kind of cool to get to have that conversation with using approaches that I'm familiar with and seeing how we can use these in a more cultural studies approach, looking at stuff that's really meaningful and relevant given our political situation in 2024 and what seems to be a landscape that we will have some trouble removing ourselves from.
Well, I think all of that, the conversation was fascinating, interesting. Hope you all enjoy it. Here's our interview with Lucas Kwong. All right, y'all, this is Horror Joy. We are here with Lucas Kwong, Associate Professor of English at the New York City College of Technology. We're going to talk about a lot of things today, but we're going to try to focus on the relationship between horror and Christian nationalism. That's the basic theme. Lucas has done a lot of work on the relationship between horror, the Gothic, Christian nationalism, had a podcast called Monster in the Mirror, which is really great, did a lot of work on that relationship. So we can talk a little bit about that today. But thank you for joining us today, Lucas.
Oh, it's lovely to be here.
Yeah, so we'll jump in. This is Horror Joy. Our whole kind of thing is thinking about how we can find joy in horror, right? And so we wanted to know if you have experiences with joy, specifically with horror. What are those like?
Well, first, I just want to say I'm really glad to be here generally, but also specifically to be talking about the conjunction of joy and horror, particularly because, you don't hear those words juxtaposed, and especially for those who are not fans of the genre, if you talk about finding joy in horror, as I learned when I was in 5th grade and my teacher sort of realized the pattern in my creative writing pursuits, they're more likely to think that something might be wrong with you, right? So on that topic, genre fiction generally and horror specifically has been a big part of my imagination, even like my understanding of myself as a person since I was pretty young. And again, I get why some people might find that borderline disturbing. Growing up in the 90s and that being the period of Stephen King's run of successes, that kind of got its fangs into me, no pun intended, pretty early. The thing that horror has always done for me, whether it's in books or it's in media form, is first, I think it validates an intuition that I think a lot of people have when they're very young, which is that something's deeply wrong with adults. You can't quite put your finger on it. And it's like, why are people hiding all these things from me? Why do mom and dad sort of talk about things, but not really talk about them? Why do I have to follow these arbitrary rules? And then, of course, when you're small, everything that's bigger is scary, whether it's bullies or just thunderstorms. So I think there's something very primal. And for me, like discovering that in the genre at an early age was, I think, a big part of the appeal. But I think another big part of it, and I actually talked about this on the first episode of Monster in the Mirror, is Stephen King in Danse Macabre, which is his nonfiction treatise, talks about the idea of being on a roller coaster, right? And why people go on roller coasters. It's to have a terrifying experience and then realize they're okay at the end and roll in and experience that satisfaction. I nearly died, but I didn't die, and I'm here. And I think, for me at least, horror undoubtedly has always had that kind of appeal. And in a weird way, since I also grew up in the church, there's a big parallel between that and, the Book of Revelation, which I guess you could say is the Bible's own horror novel. That's what it does. Is probably one of the earliest examples of literature of that arc, where you go through dragons and beasts and people having their flesh ripped off, so that at the end, with the New Jerusalem and everything being wrapped up in a tidy bow, it is that much more cathartic, I guess. So yeah, I'd say that's when I hear the words horror and joy together, that's sort of what comes to mind.
I love all that. I mean, there's so much in there that I think we can talk about. Jeff, you've talked a lot about this sense in which you can watch horror and there's joy in the sense of seeing that the horror is not you. You can feel safe.
I think this idea where like the roller coaster, like you mentioned, King's Danse Macabre, it's a really great metaphor to think about how horror works. Roller coasters typically are safe. People do die on them from time to time, but typically they're safe. But I think sometimes the joy of horror is that it's not happening to me. Sometimes that can be from a place of privilege, but also it's part of the suspension of disbelief that we have in the horror genre.
I realized as you were talking, another way to put it, why it appealed to me was a kind of ideological rebellion. Because I did grow up in a Christian upbringing. And setting aside what I just said about Revelation, in the very staid Protestant evangelical upbringing, immigrant church I grew up in, that's not really the emphasis. It's very much about an ordered universe, especially in the Calvinist tradition, which is what I grew up in. Suffering ultimately is redemptive. Everything works out. And then simultaneous with that was, of course, this reflexive fear of the world. My church was not alone in having these alternatives to Halloween, Hallelujah nights, where you can dress up, but not in anything scary, like clown, but not a scary clown, that kind of thing. And I even remember going to, and this was kind of a throwback even then, a conference about kind of like the dangers of worldly music, where they did that thing where they actually play Stairway to Heaven and AC/DC or one of them backwards so that you could hear what is allegedly the devil. It's in that environment that I think I really gravitated towards. A couple examples come to mind. First, actually, when I was 15, The Exorcist was re-released in theaters. It's weird because it was the 27th anniversary, which is a random anniversary for, you get the sense that it was delayed for 2 years, but they re-released it. I'd never seen it before, and they added, I don't know if you're familiar with the re-release, they have the infamous spider walk scene, which is where Reagan is walking downstairs backwards, and obviously that leaves an indelible mark. I'm sure for a lot of people, The Exorcist, especially people growing up in Christian backgrounds, is kind of like a bridge from that more cloistered worldview to a more open understanding of maybe horror, but also even like evil generally. This is just my theory, but because what I think the power of The Exorcist, at least for me, was ultimately, of course, Reagan has the demon cast out of her and all is right with the world. But it's like, at what cost? You see that the father has to throw himself out the window, and even as the credits roll, there's kind of like this sense that this poor girl will be traumatized for the rest of her life. So I feel like in that combination where there's a relatively happy ending, at least for a horror movie, but also this sense that things are still not really okay, that I think left an imprint on me to continue evolving, I guess, ideologically to this point where I do still consider myself a kind of Christian, but I think really shedding a very rigid understanding of evil, of, what theologians call the theodicy question. Why is suffering? Where does suffering come from? As kind of strange as it sounds, there is a joy and a sort of liberation in having that intuition validated by horror, that, sometimes it's really not okay. Sometimes suffering is inexplicable and terrible. And that can sound like a downer, but I also think it can provide a counterweight to what feels like gaslighting, particularly if all the authorities in your life are kind of giving you a different message.
Yeah, that's a really fantastic way to think about it. We've talked, especially on religious horror, about how belief works with horror. So what you were saying there really resonates with some of our conversations we've been having thus far on the podcast. As someone who was raised Catholic, who I'm not a practicing Catholic anymore, I don't even go during, Christmas or Easter, but there's something about that sort of belief system, that framework that makes movies that are about religious horror, like The Exorcist, for example, with sort of demons or exorcisms, or like some of the religious horror we talked about with Immaculate and Saint Maud, resonate, I think, differently than it will for other audiences. Like, I'm still to this day in 2024 terrified of Ouija boards because I don't want to mess with demons. Like, I don't even know if I really believe in demons, but I was raised in a framework in which demons are a real and present danger because you're always going to go to hell. So, I mean, I appreciate your response to that and how like there is something joyful in things maybe being not often or not always explainable. Sometimes things are bad just because things are bad.
Right.
So I wonder then how horror in this way works with Christian nationalism.
Sure.
Because we really appreciate your argument in the podcast Monster in the Mirror. So I see belief working with Christian nationalism in a certain way. And I sort of heard that in your episodes too. So could you maybe talk a bit about that?
Sure. So maybe I should back up and just say a little bit about the premise of the podcast, which I produced in 2022, very graciously with the help of Brian's brother, Bradley, for Straight White American Jesus. So the podcast Monster in the Mirror looks at what I think of as the Victorian genesis of Christian nationalism. What I'm trying to get at is, while obviously they didn't use terms like Christian nationalism, in the 1890s, the perceived sense of imperial decline in the British Empire gave rise to this kind of spate of stories and narratives to try to make sense of, why do we feel this way? Is it because God has abandoned us? What is the worst thing that could happen to the Christian empire that is Great Britain, and how might we overcome it? Very similar questions to the ones that are being asked today, right? And so my argument is that really structures the plot and the themes, and really you could say the theology of, novels like Dracula, but the podcast also covers lesser known works like this novel, The Beetle, which came out the same year as Dracula, forgotten today, but arguably more popular at the time, which yokes the monstrosity to androgyny. So while it's not a quote-unquote good book, it is a very instructive, and there's a lot there for analysis in terms of how it plays on the specifically Christian queer phobia and corollary fear of societal degeneration that, of course, is very much at the forefront of Christian nationalism today. So I'm not saying that, Donald Trump has Dracula by his book stand, but I am saying that these are perennial fears. These are perennial concerns, especially when you have this conjunction of a strong national identity with a strong sense of religious vocation. And then you throw on top of that race, whiteness, and the fear of racial pollution. All of that combined in some ways makes it almost inevitable that today, when those same fears have taken hold, we would see something like a return to the quote-unquote holy conspiracy, that Dracula is not just about a vampire who is definitely coded Jewish and who is, has this secret plot to turn England into vampires, but then you have this counter-conspiracy of the holy knights, the neo-crusaders who have to work in secret to defeat this evil because it's so far-reaching and so nefarious that only by working in secret can they restore the nation. I mean, that's basically QAnon. And if you don't get it, well, that's because you're not initiated. You don't have the eyes to see and to connect all the dots that Van Helsing and Jonathan Harker have. So the horror is really providing a function of expelling the other, whether it's the racial other, the sexualized other, the religious other. The other thing that I'll say, though, is that because horror stems from this really deep place in the psyche, it's also inherently unstable. And so when you read something like Dracula, the horror is also constantly undercutting the religious certainty and dogmatism and absolutism that the book's also appealing to. So even as Dracula is trying to reassure readers that Britain can't be made great again, that all it takes is a new generation of crusaders to expel the vampire, it is still nonetheless haunted, I think, by this sense that, well, even if you stake the vampire, you didn't do it in the right way, he might come back again. There's always a loophole somewhere, right, Jeffrey, as you were saying, like some things are inexplicable. And that, I think, lies deep to me in the Christian nationalist psyche. And I think that's what drives a lot of the redoubling of the efforts to purify the nation. Because the deeper the horror of the racial other, the deeper the sense that what if it's so horrific and so inexplicable that even the God that I think will inevitably deliver justice cannot overcome this. I think in that light, horror and its many contradictions and instabilities is pretty germane, actually, to how Christian nationalists think about our present situation.
As you were talking there, this reminded me of Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities. So the way you're describing Christian nationalism, it seems like these folks are creating a community that does not exist other than inside of their mind. That's super fascinating to me, given that they're then weaponizing things like race, things like sexuality, things like religion, things like national origin as the outsiders while they're like the insiders. That's really an interesting way to think about it. So thank you for that.
And to that point, what you just said reminded me of an important thing to remember when it comes to the backstory of the context of things like Dracula is that by that point, the empire has already been in existence for arguably almost 2 centuries. You could argue that Britain's coming into its own as a nation and its existence as an empire are virtually one and the same. Whereas if you contrast it with America, like we could argue that America as an empire really kind of expanded in the 20th century, and obviously it was involved abroad in the 19th century, but it didn't really come into its imperial existence then. Britain's identity had so long been not just we're a nation, but we're like the foremost Christian empire. So then it's like, what do you do when you perceive that as about to have an expiration date? It creates this crisis and this need to reimagine that community.
That makes a lot of sense. Actually, the very first thing that I ever published was something on Dracula. Well, it was really on vampires and racism. And I think it's interesting that you talk about how Dracula is Jewish coded, but is referred to as Oriental kind of over and over again, right, in the text. And so there's this sense in which there's a clear, they're the other, that's different, we don't want that.
Yeah.
The very mixing of blood, the impurity, right? All those conversations are wrapped up there. And something that I did in that chapter is to highlight how the image of the vampire has changed up until somebody like Edward Cullen, who is so white that his skin sparkles. And Edward Cullen is therefore kind of the safe vampire. Right. We fall in love with Edward Cullen.
It's for the boy band era. He's the boy band era NSYNC vampire.
Yeah, NSYNC vampire. I like that. So, you update these images, but they retain some kind of sense of that same us versus them. The vampire is now safe because it is white, it is male, it is straight, whatever it is, right? They just fit our understanding of safe. So I didn't know if maybe you have seen more recent iterations of the relationship between horror and Christian nationalism. Has that popped up for you in recent horror?
It definitely has popped up. So I'm sure, I don't know if you guys are familiar with like Frank Peretti, for example. Frank Peretti is kind of like Stephen King if you got rid of all the ambiguity and you made sure that everything was wrapped up in a nice tidy bow at the end. But there was this great Vox article a couple years ago on how Frank Peretti's books, which again are about angels and demons, this very Pentecostal theology, presaged the imagination of right-wing evangelicals today. It's almost like everything is horror in the sense that when you look at the rhetoric of Christian nationalist speeches, when you look at the kinds of content that is shared and boosted, for example, like I was looking at CBN's YouTube channel, and there's a whole subgenre of videos on CBN which are just about demons and talking about demons being real, and also sharing videos purporting to be about showing demons and being exorcised. And I'd actually be curious, Jeffrey, about your perspective on this fascination with exorcism, which seems to be almost to the point of burying the ancient division between Protestant and Catholic because of The Exorcist. I think a lot of white evangelical Protestants, when they think exorcism, they think of Catholics. Another example I just saw, there was this video of Greg Locke purporting to be Greg Locke exorcising his own congregation, or like a witch in the congregation in the video. What that reminds me of is, and this is another trend in the genre that kind of like blossomed when I was growing up, is the found footage genre. And to me, why found footage is scary is that it's not focused on the blood. It's almost asking the audience to play a game where you have to see things that less curious or less observant viewers wouldn't see, right? That thing that's in the background, and the sense that, oh, wow, this is like really happening. It also reminds me, there are other videos where it's like the reptile Illuminati videos, where if you pause the video at a certain point, you can see in the eyes of whoever it is, their eyes go lizard-like for just a split second, and you can really see it. I'll caveat, not to say that all Christian nationalists are way into reptilian Illuminati videos, but I think it is instructive of a certain mindset that is very much redolent to me of the mindset that's expected of audiences at a found footage horror film. And I gotta be honest, I get the appeal of that as a horror fan, especially because I also do think that, there are terrible truths that are in front of us. CF Jeffrey Epstein. On the right, this mentality of living in a found footage horror movie where the clues are all around you and you can see it in the background of the grainy footage is just turned up to another level. I think that's a somewhat long-winded way of saying I think the genre is very much alive in Christian nationalism.
Yeah, something interesting that I think is there too is that not only is there a reality in which the right or Christian nationalists are watching the horror unfold in terms of lizard, Illuminati, or whatever it is, but that we watch on TikTok or Instagram or wherever pastors shooting images of the Easter Bunny on stage. This is also a kind of almost David Lynch kind of weird horror that's going on that we can watch unfold as well, right? So there's a found footage element to it. We could just imagine that Christian nationalism itself is just kind of this weird found footage horror that's unfolding in front of us.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I'm curious whether you guys, if any particular spectacles come to mind as playing the role of Van Helsing or whatever, or being horrific in and of themselves, because that's also the weird thing, like you were saying, these performances are themselves kind of grotesque and weird and off-putting, and sometimes I even feel like part of what's enjoyable for the audience at, say, like an Awaken conference is how weird and grotesque, but I don't know. So yeah, I mean, I'm curious to hear what you guys think about that spectacle.
There was something really interesting that I was thinking about when you were mentioning how now evangelical megachurch pastors have almost become the thing they're not supposed to be, which is to say Catholic, in the sense of we are going to cast demons out on like televangelists. We are going to handle snakes. We are going to speak in tongues. And these are all of the things that the Reformation really hated about the Catholic Church. These are all the things that if you believe in something like exorcism and you believe in something like demonic possession, that was supposed to die with Catholicism as far as like Reformation and Protestant denominations are concerned. But there's something about, like you said, with the lizard Illuminati and conspiracy theories that become, at least in America, like this sort of new mythology, this new bastardized spirituality where we don't like what we see in front of us. So we're going to make up a mythology. We are going to latch on to a conspiracy. It's like they've exponentially increased the need for the exorcism. Rather than one person, we need to exorcise the country or something. And it's super gross, and it feels bad to think about the fact that we have these pastors who are essentially preaching politics from behind the pulpit. And, you know, I'm not going to get into like tax code and stuff here. However, there is something to be said for that separation of church and state that a large portion of the country just no longer believes it. I mean, we just went through this whole current event alert. We have a sounder for that, Brian. The flags above the Alito households, but like there's this strange, we need to bring Christian purity back to American politics, and that it's not here. That's the horror that apparently these people live with every day, which is really bizarre to me.
I was just talking to my wife about this, how that upside down flag, what was weird to me is that, isn't that how right wingers think the left feels about America? It would almost be like flying like an upside down cross or something.
It feels like everything is whoever smelt it, dealt it kind of politics, where you're actually just doing everything that you're claiming the other folks are doing. And just to kind of bring this back to the horror conversation, I will highlight Midnight Mass. I'm not sure if you've seen it.
Oh, yeah. I'd love to talk about that.
Yeah, spoiler for anybody who has not seen it yet. But the thing that is interesting and resonating for me with this conversation is specifically that the religious community on the island in Midnight Mass takes up with the vampire. It's as if there's this weird flip that happens and the vampire becomes the savior. And they're using the vampire as a mechanism of reclaiming some kind of purity, power, whatever it might be. And this feels like it fits in with the things that we're saying here, that the flipped flag and even the desire for some exorcism of the nation via mechanisms of power that were probably not acceptable not too long ago. Or in your argument, maybe they have been. Maybe they've always been there, right? QAnon kind of has always kind of been in the background all the way back to at least Dracula.
Yeah, I mean, the Protocols of Elders of Zion, in fact, really took off around the same time as Dracula. But yeah, I mean, about Midnight Mass, which I very much enjoyed. Yeah, it reminds me, I believe part of the mythos in the show, and they kind of like drop this in the middle. Man, this is really spoiling the whole thing for people who, if they haven't seen it, but, you know, throwing caution to the wind. You know, we find out that like the priest, the young dude who's come, you know, to the town is really the same guy as the old priest who was in the Holy Land. There was a storm and he took refuge in like a tomb, which, speaking of The Exorcist, reminds me of the beginning of The Exorcist, because The Exorcist begins with this Babylonian temple, right, which is where the demons unleashed. But anyway, the priest is bitten by the vampire in this underground layer in the Holy Land. But doesn't he refers to it as an angel, actually.
Yeah, that's right.
The priest, after he's bitten, he doesn't think of it as a horrific experience. In fact, he thinks of it as being touched by God and being gifted by God with eternal life. I think that there's this obsession with the boogeyman of the right-wing Christian imagination that becomes something like reverence or admiration as well. That is seen in the need to overrun, the Capitol, for example, and just destroy this symbol or what people on the right have ostensibly always taken to hold in reverence, all these sites and sacred symbols of the nation, just completely like wreck it and almost feels like this id that's being released, but it's okay. Because you're doing it in order to make sure that the real bad guys don't. I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but it sounds like something similar that Mike Flanagan was commenting on in Midnight Mass, with the vampire actually being the one to sort of bring the community together through this horrific power.
Yeah, we can move on here, but I think there's something really interesting about the fact that the priest is brought back to youth. He's old and dying, maybe as a symbol of the
Right.
church itself. Brought back to youth how? Through what is taken as an angelic power, but everybody else on the island, the lens through which the audience sees the activity, this is clearly some kind of destructive power. I think there's something there that mirrors this kind of relationship between horror and Christian nationalism.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And very King inspired. It just struck me like the small isolated community, people with secrets, that kind of thing. It's definitely redolent of Salem's Lot.
Yeah, so maybe to transition a bit, one of the things we want to do with this podcast with horror is to engage media beyond movies and books, which are going to be the sort of first two things folks think about likely with horror. So do you play like any horror games, whether it's video games, tabletop, anything to that effect?
I have always been on the fringes of video game culture, more as an admirer than a participant, mainly because growing up, it was never really my forte. Getting slaughtered in GoldenEye was usually my fate. But I will say, one of the pieces of media that's really rejuvenated my appreciation of horror was actually an album put out by this rap group called Clipping. It's a really great group, and they have an album called Visions of Bodies Being Burned. And the title track is basically based on the plot of Candyman. And it's fantastic. It's drawing on hip hop's storytelling, which has always been germane to the genre. But they're also obviously very much aficionados of horror soundtracks. It reminded me that horror is not just visual or literary, but it's also oral and auditory, and about what you hear and what you don't hear.
Yeah, thank you for that suggestion. We hadn't really thought much about sort of horror through music, but that's an interesting direction we could take with it. So you're a fringe video game player. Have you ever played Dungeons and Dragons? Do we need to have the Red Scare conversation? It's the satanic panic.
I have not played Dungeons and Dragons, but we can certainly talk about the satanic panic. But I do remember there being very serious debates when I was in 6th grade about things like Bloody Mary and Ouija boards, and like very earnest discussions about whether this was a good idea. So, it felt real, growing up as someone who was, in the church and had that perspective.
Yeah, and those are games, right? You play a game with your friends. You do the Bloody Mary thing in the bathroom, or just having your tooth fall out and a fairy take your tooth is a game that we play that seems to invoke some kind of other thing that would be horrific. Maybe if it didn't come with a dollar bill or something, maybe the anxiety of losing your teeth is so great that having some fairy come in and steal your teeth while you're asleep is fine, because that's better, actually.
Yeah, I mean, that just goes back to the way that fairy tales have for so long been inherently horrific, and we kind of like paper that over, but they're pretty grotesque. Hansel and Gretel's another example. Yeah, I mean, going back to music, like, even if you go back to something like Highway to Hell, or there's a reason why simultaneously bands from that era leaned into the satanic imagery and then got called out for it or like stigmatized. It was almost like this dialectic where both parties fed on the other's either religiosity or lack of religiosity, because the more that they were demonized, literally, the more mystique they had. I also remember growing up, Marilyn Manson, of course, being like the new Alice Cooper, around whom so many rumors were swirling, and obviously he wasn't shy about flaunting his quote-unquote satanic credentials. So yeah, I mean, like, definitely rock music actually, I guess looking back, was I wouldn't say I was super into like goth rock per se, but was another source of the kind of like frisson or sense of like ideological rebellion that horror also offered. So it seems natural to me that there would be a crossover or affinity there. And similarly with rap inherently being a rebellious genre, it makes sense to me why clipping would, come out with something like horror rap.
I like that conversation. And Jeff, like you're saying, we haven't even thought about music. There's part of me that worries about the conversation about nu metal. That was a genre that did not resonate with me personally, and I think I've tried to avoid talking about it, but we can do that, right? I think I was even thinking of, like Bone Thugs and Harmony. It feels like they had like a kind of horror thing going on there.
Yeah, definitely.
I love that. There's something joyful about horror as liberation in some way from fixed ideologies. And so even thinking about music as something that liberates that's great. I really like that. So you have an article coming out for Victorian Studies on religion and Gothic literature. Didn't know if you wanted to say anything about that. What's the argument there?
Yeah, it's actually a special issue. So I'm writing about Victorian Gothic, specifically this obscure, very obscure. It's written by the guy who wrote The Beetle, Richard Marsh, but it's called The Joss, and it's about a Chinese idol that is circulating throughout London that is supposed to have supernatural powers. And I wrote it for this special issue on religion and imperialism, which will be published in Victorian Studies. I gravitated toward it partly because of being a horror fan, but also because of my work thinking about anti-Asian racism and Christian nationalism. In 2021, I started this open letter that was focused on calling out the associations between, major GOP politicians and major churches. So for a while, I've been thinking about that and thinking about how the new xenophobia and panic about China, to the extent of wanting to ban TikTok, which I'm not going to pretend I'm on TikTok or a fan of TikTok, but it's just interesting with every single social media network having a long and flourishing record of broadcasting all kinds of nonsense and terrible things. TikTok is the one that's singled out as being especially beyond the pale, right? Seeing that and the centrality of yellow peril to Christian nationalism and, Brian, as you were talking about, Orientalism really being so germane to recovering a sense of white Christian identity. It brought me to look at this book, The Joss, which is probably one of the most explicitly anti-Asian works of that period. So, for example, Dracula is very much, as we were talking about, coded in certain respects Jewish, but he could also be a few other things, right? He's also coded, as you say, as Oriental, quote unquote. And in the end, he's actually coded as Eastern European and even Christian himself because he was a crusader. Whereas in this book, The Jaws, it's very clear that the villains are, if not literally Chinese, then at least from the Far East. So the article's kind of investigating why and how the villains, insofar as they are visually Chinese or appear to the white heroes as Oriental, like there's a lot of comments on the color of the skin and the eyes and that kind of thing, it kind of registers this moment at which heathenness, quote unquote, becomes something closer to what we have today, which is not an explicitly Christian derogation of wrong belief, which is historically what it was, right? To be heathen was to worship someone other than the true God. Rather, heathen in the sense of what lies underneath, for example, early in the pandemic, the obsession with like, oh, the wet market and how those Chinese people eat anything under the sun. And you know what I mean? It's a subtler kind of derogation of physical signs of barbarity and or not, basically not being white, not being Western, that still has overtones of the Christian fear of what is satanic, but has sort of been secularized or semi-secularized, if that makes sense. And I think that's true now because, like I said, not only when it came to the coronavirus did you see the new discourse about what Chinese people eat, which in the 19th century was always in the context of, and that's why they're a non-Christian barbaric people. You know, now we don't hear that quite on the surface, but it is subtext. But now also in 2024, the recent panic about Chinese migrants. Now it's not just that they're coming from Latin America, they're coming from China and then to Latin America and then into the States. And that is, I think, renewing, perhaps after a brief lull post-coronavirus, this fear of, invasion from the yellow peril. So that's all sort of in the background of looking at this book from the 1890s, which again, to me, is telling a very familiar story, telling maybe like an early version of a story that's still being told right now.
That's super fascinating. That sounds really neat. So given like this sort of focus on the Gothic in the books from that sort of period of literature known as the Gothic, and sort of the way you're talking about the Gothic, Brian and I talked about this a bit in a previous episode about how the Gothic sort of works in horror. I'm curious if you think that in 2024, we're like in some sort of strange Gothic revival, given that sort of our country is in this post-capital, post-industrial malaise. So yeah, I don't know if that has to do with like, maybe this is why we see these same concerns about others popping up again, the way in which we might see horror weaponized in that way.
For sure.
So thinking about your response there and how this article is talking about the Gothic being that sort of genre of literature, but also as kind of a period of time in Victorian culture. So I'm wondering if in 2024, if you see any parallels, like are we in some sort of American Gothic, not in the art sense, but in a sort of post-capital, post-industrial sort of wash, and how horror is sort of playing with that?
So this is an excellent opportunity for me to talk about another source of horror joy that I can't believe I mentioned yet, which is Jordan Peele movies. A few years ago when I taught a course on Gothic literature at City Tech, New York City College of Technology, where I teach. One of the things I assigned was we watched not Get Out, which is a great movie. We actually watched Us, which is his 2019 movie, maybe less well known, but to me, very rich and maybe even more kind of ambiguous and open to interpretation. And to your point, Jeffrey, very much interested in American decline. The movie, not to get too far into the details, but it's about doppelgangers who arise from underground and who are the doubles of the main characters. The movie focuses on this middle upper class black family. They're on vacation and there's this other family, a white family. There's obviously some sense in which racial differences and really America's anti-blackness structures the relationship, but that is kind of in the background, and then all of a sudden everybody's evil twin kind of bursts out from underground. There's kind of uprising. So on one level, just literally on the sense of like visuals, it's a very Gothic movie in the look of it and the cinematography being set on a seaside resort where everything's just a little too bright, but there's also very long shadows and there's this kind of ruined and dilapidated amusement park. Visually, I think it captures something so fundamental to how people across the spectrum, how we think of America now. Because obviously, those of us who are not immersed in the right-wing Christian nationalist imagination can see physical signs of decay everywhere. We can see it in the crumbling infrastructure, right? We can see it in the bridge I can't remember what state it was, that literally collapsed a couple months ago, I think, when a ship ran under it. But even on the right, when we think about the inauguration speech 2017, American Carnage, this vision of cities being destroyed by the Democrats, I almost think in their minds like cities like New York are lined with charred out husks of cars and fires and trash cans, things like that. The movie Us, it doesn't quite go that far, but in basically showing how these images like the amusement park, this almost Norman Rockwellian site of innocence, has been turned into something sinister and toxic and is harboring these secrets that are festering underground. It's just like a very potent visual metaphor for where we are. It's really interesting to me when it's talking about the intersection of race and capitalism, that this family, which is obviously upwardly mobile and has reached a kind of parity with this white family, but then nonetheless, even though there's a rough kind of economic parity, they can feel the way in which they're not quite there because they're not white. And that is then further thrown into very stark relief where they're just settling into this vacation and they can't even enjoy it because now everybody's evil twin has emerged from underground. So it, to me, was really about how American life is predicated on competition that has now been pushed to an apocalyptic tempo. Because now you're competing not just with everybody else and not just with everybody else's evil twin, you're competing with your own evil twin for survival. And actually, just the other day, I was watching a video about what you could argue is the soft recession that we're in. That obviously, on paper, we're not in a recession, but anecdotally, and I've had friends who can attest to this. The job market is just brutal. I mean, it's a horror story in of itself. You go for like 5 rounds of interviews now, you might not get the job, and that's combined with this obsession with making sure your workers are in the office, and you better be in tip-top shape because layoffs are just around the corner like all the time. So I definitely think that we live in a Gothic time. And that's not even looking at the climate crisis globally. I just think if we think about where we're at in the States and the way that competition, especially post-coronavirus, has been pushed to this almost like post-apocalyptic battle for survival, I think that's also why post-apocalyptic genre generally is popular. So yeah, definitely, I think the Gothic just sort of pervades our cultural moment.
I like your inclusion of us, because I think something that I've thought about as you were talking here is that in us, there's a whole kind of thing, and I don't know if this is a spoiler, so if you haven't seen it, I don't know, close your ears, I guess, but there's a whole thing about Hands Across America. So this kind of competition where you're competing against even your twin, your doppelganger, there's a desire by the doppelganger to be like, hey, you know what we should do? We should hold hands. We should kind of like fix this. But the fix is also horrific, right? We can't even imagine a fix that's not horrific.
Now, I can't remember, does the Hands Across America play a role in the plot? Like, is it part of the experiment, or is it just kind of like one of those ambiguous Kubrick-type Easter eggs, like in The Shining, where there's so many things that could be interpreted? I can't remember which it is.
Definitely spoiler here. So again, if you haven't seen it, this is definitely the spoiler. Initially, one of the opening scenes, we see the original girl, the young girl, can't remember her name now, watches Hands Across America on TV. The switch happens, and that girl that watched that Hands Across America is now in the underground. And so there's this sense in which her childlike image of what it means to come together as community is twisted in that underground place, and therefore comes to the surface as something horrific. So yeah, it's definitely a kind of setup. I mean, Peele is incredible at this. It's a setup and a payoff from beginning to end. And Us, I think, is brilliant. It's unsatisfying for me personally, but I think it's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, and Hands Across America, I'm being reminded of this rabbit hole. Wasn't that was in the 80s, just for some context? That was like the USA, we are the world kind of era of humanitarian causes, right?
That's right.
So, I mean, that's just interesting to me because that evokes the Reagan 80s, and obviously Reagan is so central to, and the 80s generally, to the conservative Christian imagination. Just reminds me of how, like, part of the power of that movie is how it, in some ways, is concerned with nostalgia and how we remember the past. And I won't spoil even further, but I think the ending turns on our understanding of the main character's memories of the past is basically nothing like their actual memories of what actually happened to them. So it's, to me, very striking that a huge part of it is kind of like totally reframing this charity event from the Reagan 80s.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. The last question I have is, there's a sense in which, right, so you read Dracula through this lens, and you can see that there is a sense in which Bram Stoker is writing the other. He is writing who he sees as the enemy, maybe. Horror recently seems to be more deliberately about transgressing the norm. So instead of reestablishing the sense of normalcy, there's a lot of horror that seems to be both highlighting what is normal and saying, oh, we need to actually push back. We need to push against what we've taken as normal. And I didn't know if you had thoughts about that as a kind of thing that's happening in horror right now.
I think there's long been a strain of horror that is transgressive in that sense, whether it's Stepford Wives, even going back to The Exorcist. I think part of what is frightening in The Exorcist is this idea that veneer of normalcy for that era, what's more normal than a happy, white, middle upper class American girl? She is the epitome and the definition of normalcy. But underneath that is literally Satan, or Rosemary's Baby from the same era, something very similar. To me, it's telling that those all came out in the 70s, which was, to me, the first serious beta declinism, which is like, we're sort of returning to that. And, then in the 80s and 90s, we had this, no, everything's better, or, it's morning again in America. I mean, Midnight Mass is a great example. That's only a couple years old, but I think Midnight Mass was trying to get to this point by the end, to find this place of, well, is it possible to have like authentic human connection that's not defined and bound by these very rigid ideologies? And I think, The Last of Us, at least based on the TV show, is kind of doing something similar, post-apocalyptic. But The Last of Us to me is like deconstructing another we didn't talk about. I know we're coming to a close, but like the Stan's idea of post-apocalyptic community. Stephen King at the end of that book, the idea is, well, we went through the plague, almost all of humanity died, but we're still making babies, and I think we're going to be okay, even though like basically 5% of the world's population remain. But The Last of Us is so brutal that you don't even get that sense, at least so far, that anybody will be okay. And it really forces us to interrogate everything that we think of as being a safeguard against deteriorating into violence. And that includes the right's attempts at providing this safeguard, which is obviously religion and authoritarian order. So yeah, I definitely think we're in a moment where, even though there are reactionary forms of horror, as I said, more manifest just generally in the popular media of the right, that horror still has a lot of potential. And maybe I'll close just by going back to that clipping album, actually, which I thought was so fantastic, because the way that the first song works with Candyman, it's taking the Candyman story, which is a great example of Black horror, and it's transforming it into song, and so it's becoming something almost like, truly like the way that stories were passed down orally from generation to generation. So I think there's great potential there for a renaissance of horror in a new form.
That's really interesting, and I am really looking forward to listening to this album now that you've brought it to our attention. But I think in closing, I'm going to ask the question that our podcast always asks, and where are we finding joy in all of this? Like we've talked about some pretty heavy topics over the course of this episode. I can sort of be glib and say that the sort of Last of Us is the exact scenario that right-wingers want. So that's their joy, but that's not my joy, not at all. So I guess reflecting on all we've talked about, how does this genre that we, all three of us on this episode, really love, bring us joy when it is sort of representing or being co-opted by so many terrible things?
Well, my kind of mini confession is that even as I recoil, obviously, at the most like openly bigoted aspects of the Christian right's vision of America, as I said before, and I don't want to take it the wrong way, I understand the appeal of living in such a bizarre Lynchian horror realm. I find a kind of weird joy, on that note, semi-related, in like bad horror and like being reacquainted with like Christian horror, like Left Behind and Frank Peretti. I was reminded reading that Vox article where in Frank Peretti, all the angels are like these really buff, kind of like jacked, amazingly good looking Aryan specimens of angels, and, the demons are just like hideous. Like it's very on the nose. The resident yoga teacher is, of course, a brown guy from South Asia. Not really specified, I don't think. But I think there's a kind of joy, in when it comes to good horror, kind of emerging on the other side and feeling like, wow, I see the world differently now. And maybe out of being reacquainted with that horror, I can find some more, whether it's compassion or understanding. But then also, I think when you deal with failed horror or bad horror, that's also, it's like Scooby-Doo, where the mask is taken off, and you remember these images that have so much power over people. There's still the potential to like expose them and to like show that it's really just a guy in a bad suit, that maybe there's still a chance that no matter how deep someone has gone, you can show them to the zipper, in the Godzilla costume, and they can start to unzip and come out of that self-induced nightmare.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I'll kind of piggyback on that and say, I think a lot of the things that I've heard you talk about resonate with me, just in terms of finding a sense of liberation, ideological liberation, and maybe just space to think differently. That is one of the greatest joys that I get from horror, is to inhabit a world, work through the emotional thing, and like you said, to come out the other end and to see the world differently, to see things from just a different perspective. But it's also grounding, right? What I hear you say with the Scooby-Doo analogy is that there's a sense in which you can say, oh, reality is here. That's that kind of almost original horror or joy of horror we talked about, that it's over there. It's not happening to me in some sense. This is actually reality. I think it's hard because right as we live through this, there are people in our bodies, like you talked about, the rise, re-rise of of Asian hate, a lot about the female body or as a spectacle, but also as under control of some institution. That's a horror. And we've talked about how in some ways this is to even talk about the joy of horror, maybe has to have some kind of privilege that we want to keep an eye on. But I do think that all the things you're saying, and I think that taking up music as a joyful thing is helpful. It's a helpful way to kind of rethink horror and joy together. I don't know. Jeff, did you have anything that you wanted to say?
I love the Scooby-Doo analogy. The idea that, I mean, at the end of every Scooby-Doo episode, as hokey as they can be, it's the idea of diffusing the horror. And that might seem difficult now, given our sort of present moment and our current circumstances. But I think the long scope of history shows us that hopefully when we get to the other side, it is just unzipping the mask or pulling the mask off of the villain and saying it was Ronald Reagan. I mean, it was just this milquetoast guy in a suit all along.
Any final thoughts, Lucas?
No, I mean, like I said, I love the premise of this podcast, and I'm sorry I should have done research by playing Dungeons and Dragons before coming on the podcast. So maybe in my reprisal, whenever I'm back on, I'll have gotten at least one round under the Dungeon Master under my belt.
And that's a goal.
Awesome.
That's a goal. Yeah, I love that. All right, let's wrap up. We've loved having you, Lucas. The conversation we had about Christian nationalism has been incredible. All the little twists and turns that we took have been a lot of fun. Can't thank you enough for being on here, spending time with us. So thank you. And hopefully we can do this again sometime in the future with some Dungeons and Dragons under our belt. All right, y'all. Thank you so much. This has been an episode of Horror Joy, produced in conjunction with Axis Mundi Media. Thanks for joining us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at Horror Joy Pod on Instagram or at Horror Joy Pod on YouTube. You can also email us at horrorjoypod@gmail.com, all one word. And you can, of course, find us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, remember, seek joy, even in horror.